And thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, Monday through Friday, 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as I continue to launch my live program via Zoom. You may be viewing this, of course, on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, DLive, and all the other subscribers. Thank you very much. You're welcome to send in chats, or you're welcome to, if you have a link to the Zoom, you can actually join the program, be heard, and even be seen if you want to be. Um, okay, and my guest is Andrew Johnson. He's a PhD graduate student at the University of California in Santa Barbara, political science, critical theory. Andrew, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Andrew, we started to, you came to my attention through academia.edu as the author of an article about fascism, but you've also written a good article, which I haven't read yet, but we could talk about it. It's obviously topical. And that is the call by many liberal Democrats to defund the police around the country. In fact, I understand that in Minneapolis, they actually have a city council majority to do just that. So I think we should go right to that and maybe work toward also an understanding of what is meant by fascism and how that idea might influence American politics. But for starters, what is the basic premise of your thinking or your article on the issue of defunding police?
Well, I don't have an article about defunding the police. I published an article, 2014, entitled Foucault, Critical Theory of the Police in a Neoliberal Age. And that article is a study of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and particularly tries to reread his work through the lens of policing instead of prisons. In particular, I was very fascinated by his quote-unquote secret history of the police from the 18th and 19th century, where police were interested in setting price controls, monitoring the grain market, quarantines for the plague, and a whole host of other sort of public service functions. And this was published, or I was writing the final edits of this when Michael Brown was shot and, was lying dead in Ferguson, Missouri, and the Ferguson riots started. And eventually this article was published when the grand jury came back with an acquittal for Officer Darren Wilson in December of 2014. And currently some of my dissertation book project sort of comes out of this article, but it also is a little critical of some of my early work. I really feel, as a young scholar, we're sort of pushed to publish and perish and all of these things. And ultimately it means that, we're trying to get our ideas out there, sometimes, before we've studied all the necessary facts. And so I certainly changed my mind a lot since this early work. In particular, I have started to focus more on the Black radical tradition and how the Black radical tradition provides a different set of theoretical tools or theoretical descriptions of American police that European thinkers such as Foucault and others don't really provide. And one of those is now we're seeing the current calls for defunding the police this very week. So I could state more about that, but that's just at least an update on some of my work so far.
Well, I mean, the history of the police vis-a-vis the African-American community is really, an interesting and important study. Obviously they were used, particularly in the South, and particularly I think in Tennessee, to basically round up black men and put them in gangs, chain gangs, up until even the early part of the 20th century, and on basically flimsy charges, in some cases no charges. And the brutality against the black men particularly has been something that I think was a major problem right up till maybe the early 1970s, when it started to decrease due to better training, but yet it's still there. obviously. I mean, that's all these instances involve it, an overreaction and overreach by police, whether they were like whether it was based on racism, they don't like someone because they're black. I mean, that I don't know, but the fact is that they were pushing black men around, and they were, maybe they were concerned. And in all the cases we're talking about recently, these were not people who were armed and dangerous. They were, involved in some minor infraction, and the reaction was that they ended up being killed. So, I totally get the fact that this is a problem. I guess that my question for you is, do you see this as a systemic problem? What is the nature of the problem? And once we can talk about that, I wonder if you would go to reforms that you think could be brought about in police departments, and even including possibly ultimately defunding police.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a broad question, so let me try to come at it in a couple different ways. First of all, some of my research is historical, and so I really am interested in the historical formation of police institutions in the United States. And as you say, the particularity of the southern states as the slave states and as the states of segregation plays an important role in that. I think there was a tweet most recently, it's sort of kind of a weird moment to see all of my research now turned into a tweet meme, but I think it was something like, props to everyone in zip ties yelling at the police, go to jstore.com and read about how police were early slave patrols. And so there is this history of
Yes.
early forms of police as slave patrols, as slave catchers in the South. And that's really interesting for this current conversation about defunding the police, because, as after the Civil War, or even a little bit beforehand is when they started getting rid of slave catchers. And after the Civil War too, there became this relationship in which former slave catchers, former police, transitioned into sort of paramilitary organizations such as the KKK. And so I would refer to this as a sort of volunteerism. And as we're sort of hearing calls for abolition or defunding, I do think that we really need to take seriously this dynamic in which, in the devolution of state institutions, we see new dynamics come about, whether it be privatization, volunteerism, and that can be both sort of paramilitary, right-wing units, but also sort of the self-defense sort of units that we've seen by the Black Panthers. And then also community, these calls for sort of community organizations of public safety. I think that we should hold those alternatives in suspicion. And I think the early history of America, or the United States rather, helps us think through some of these relations. But I guess I do want to also point out that this is not just an issue with the southern states. The normal history of police institutions has been a story about how police were created in a mimicking of the European model in the 1850s, particularly in the urban cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And we saw, at least in the 1960s, urban uprisings simultaneously as the civil rights movement that were in northern or western cities, Los Angeles, Detroit, New Jersey. And
Right.
so this isn't just an issue about the sort of kind of backward South. This
Not
is
at all. In
something.
fact, the most recent instances have been in predominantly either northern cities or border cities or kind of liberal Democrat cities.
Liberal Democrat cities.
like New York, like Baltimore, St. Louis, Minneapolis. These are, predominantly what we euphemistically call the so-called blue states that you have these instances. So I guess first of all, what's going on with that? I mean, how is it that is it a systemic problem in police departments, or is it bad cops? I mean, I think in the case of Minneapolis, at least from a kind of a superficial glance at it, and we'll find out more, it looked like a bad cop who had actually been already involved in something like 20 infractions and violent instances and had been involved with killing someone. And yet there he was still on the police department and allowed to function. So I guess is it a problem of bad cops? Is it a problem of cover up? Is it a problem of governments basically turning a blind eye to these cops and allowing them to function like that?
It's an amazing question. I think that it really demands our attention. So a lot of, Minneapolis has a Democratic mayor, Democratic city council, Democratic governor. And yeah, the police officer that killed George Floyd has a very long history of excessive force, and he looks like he could be, quote unquote, a bad apple. However, I think we need to also take seriously this thing that maybe there's a bad orchard. We know that Amy Klobuchar, a possible vice president contender for Joe Biden, as well as a Democratic senator, was one of the district attorneys that allowed that didn't prosecute George, this officer. We also know that 3 police officers watched this killing and didn't do anything to intervene. Right. And one of the big arguments that we've been seeing recently is by a sort of foundation-funded nonprofit industrial complex organization called Campaign Zero, headed by D. Ray McKesson. And they've been advocating for a 8 Can't Wait campaign, which is really focused on use of force policies and saying that if we change these use of force policies, then we won't really see these police killings anymore. And ultimately, Minneapolis was a model for police reform. So we can't just say that this was a case of a bad actor. Minneapolis was one of the poster cities for Obama's 21st century era of police reform. And so we really have to take into consideration these things, because, the chokehold that killed Eric Garner was banned in New York City. Nevertheless, the officer that killed Eric Garner continued to serve as an officer of the NYPD for 5 or 6 years until just recently, and he was being paid $125,000 a year, when in New York City the average salary is $60,000 average salary, and he continued to be making money regardless of the fact that New York City had a ban on the chokehold that killed Eric Garner. And so I think that is one reason why we are seeing calls for defunding the police. Is some of this is a internal battle between different parts of the Democratic base. One part being the sort of foundation-funded, moderate wing that might be supported by institutional actors like the former Obama administration, and other sort of more radical organizations like the Movement for Black Lives, and they're more responsive to the social movements on the street. And I could try to talk to you a little bit about why there's a reasoning to defund the police as a slogan, as a political, as a sort of, there's some political momentum breaking up onto this issue. But I think that it really it's based upon the fact that this is a systemic issue. Yes, we when we watch these videos, it's really easy to think, wow, maybe there was a reason for that that killing. Maybe Mike Brown was, charging at a police officer, or maybe this was a bad apple. But the United States kills over 1,000 people a year by police officers, and that's more than any other developed country. We also lead the world in the number of people in prisons. We have 2 million people in prisons, and that doesn't count the further number of people that are in immigration detention camps, that are in military detention camps, that are also in municipal and county jails. And so these are really, really big systemic issues, of which there are institutional forces that are invested in the policing and incarceration of people of Americans, of sometimes disproportionately people of color and Black folks. And maybe we could also talk about this issue about race, because I think race is a driving frame in which a lot of people are forming their ideas about the issue of police in the United States.
One of the first thoughts that I had when this story broke, and that it became apparent that part of the story was that this officer had been on the force for a long time and he'd already had a bad record, is it made me think about the movie Serpico back in the 1970s. He was a New York cop who always wanted to be a cop. He went into the police department. He encountered all this corruption, people doing all kinds of stuff, both criminally, but also in terms of brutality. And that there was this sort of code of omerta, this kind of, you don't talk about other officers. And that he discovered that this went all the way up to the top. And eventually he was shot, and then he left the country. I mean, it's a true story. And there were reforms afterwards as a reaction to it. And then I wonder if, this is part of the, and I'm not trying to cast a big blanket here, but many of the police patrolmen's associations and police unions are, they kind of take almost a Masonic oath of secrecy. And there's this kind of like, I'm going to protect you if you protect me. And that's a situation that could become ripe for corruption, as it did in New York during Serpico's times. I wonder if that's part of this. Now, and you might want to comment on that. As far as like the incarceration rates in the United States, I think really started to skyrocket in the 90s with the Clinton era, with third strike laws and all of these other laws, the war on drugs by George Bush, and all these new laws were put in place, ended up putting untold thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in prison for minor crimes, like having a nickel bag or having a joint or something like that. And President Trump has started the process of addressing it with the first step legislation that ended up with the release of 10,000 prisoners, 90% of whom are Black. And I think there's going to be more reform in that way. But you're quite right that it's become almost like an industrial complex of prisons, and you have the privatization like they had in California, and it came up during the campaign of Kamala Harris, who had been a big advocate of that, and the state actually profiting from it. So, there becomes an incentive to put people in prison because it becomes almost a business. So I think that we could look at the bigger questions here, the more systemic questions of why so many people are incarcerated in this country and really should not be. I mean, I think that actually more conservative people are against that kind of incarceration. You want to have only really dangerous, violent people, or people involved with serious crimes of fraud, like a Bernie Madoff, are people who should be incarcerated. Not some poor schmo on the street who's selling a nickel bag of marijuana.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question for you. Do you happen to know what I guess the most common form of theft in the United States is?
The most common form of theft. I don't know, probably pretty petty, but I don't know. What is it?
It's wage theft, and it's never policed, never prosecuted. And I think that gets to this issue about, talking about Madoff, or the Bernie Sanders campaign sort of used this rhetoric a lot, that no one's been prosecuted who was responsible for the 2008 financial crisis, and nevertheless we're still putting people in jail for joints. And so I do think that this becomes a big frame that is used. So I think that on the issue of Serpico, Serpico actually wrote an article for Politico, maybe 2015, sort of trying to talk about his experience in the NYPD and how that might be useful for thinking about police reform efforts in the era of Black Lives Matter. I think that corruption, and thinking about the relationship of police to corruption, is really, really important. Because if you were to think about how police operate in a place like Mexico, for example, in places where you might have less of a developed police force, oftentimes these institutions act as protection rackets, in which corruption is the fundamental aspect of some of their job. And this goes back to history. So if you look at before the creation of European municipal police departments in the 18th century, you had a very long history of sort of kind of community-based sheriffs and police forces and taxmen who sort of formalized corruption. And it was a big aspect of how the state operated, but there's also these autonomous forces out there that are using the authority given to them by the state to subsidize their own salaries. And so I think that this is really important. And as we think about police globally, I think we sort of see this schism still happening. And the example of Mexico and the United States is a really great example to bring that out. Now, in regards to unions and police organizations, there is indeed a culture that is trained in these organizations, and it's far different from the type of culture you see taught in European police departments or Japanese police departments, and that's a big problem, and that's why there's also police unions are being put under the spotlight by reform advocates as in need of maybe abolishing or at least minimizing their power, because they really do have a lot of power. They sort of protect killer cops. They've kind of become sort of run by these sort of far right forces within police societies. And this is all pretty complex. Police, are a very sort of masculine-based institution, one that has a sort of a code of authority that is a big basis of how they train new recruits and of how they've operated historically and to the present. But yes, I do think that there is a really great deal of possibility for, I wouldn't say bipartisanship on this issue, but there are conservative forces that are taking up the mantle of this. So,
no, absolutely. I think that from my perspective, if you look at the Constitution, the highest policing authority in the land is supposed to be the county sheriff, and they are elected. They are they're a representative form, and that they are supposed to, any kind of militia, private or public, is supposed to be regulated by them. It's in the Second Amendment. We have a guarantee of a well-regulated militia. And so you have a balance between civilian authority that's accountable to the people and a limited, very well-regulated grant of authority to a militia group, whether it be a city or town police department or a private militia group. And to my way of thinking, that is a very good balance, because as a conservative, I'm concerned about public employees and public and authority as playing too strong a role in our lives, and of usurping individual rights. And what could be a bigger usurpation of individual rights than a cop who is a public official killing someone, for unless they're armed and dangerous, and unless you can have, there should be a review board to take a look at the situation. I mean, if a policeman's life is threatened, and you have someone who's lashing out with weapons, then that may be the only solution that they have to them. It's easy for me to say, it's this is a very dangerous job, but any situation like that ought to be put under review by local authorities, under a sheriff or whoever, to see what was going on. But what about, is there really such systemic racism at this point? Because I think there certainly was, right up until maybe the early 70s when it began to lessen. But I think it was quite common for police to harass Black men, and it was race oriented. I mean, in a way, you could kind of say, well, that's where the crime existed, and that other ethnic minorities were harassed in their day when they had criminal problems. You could look at the way Italians were treated in South Chicago in the 1920s, or even the Irish maybe in the 19th century, because they had crime. Eventually, the crime problems lessened. They moved out to the burbs, and so it didn't happen as much. Well, in the Black neighborhoods, there is still a crime problem, so they're going after Black men. Putting that aside, do you think that this is a systemic race problem as it's now being portrayed?
Well, let me kind of finish the thought about conservative thinking, and then I'll try to answer the question about
Sure.
race. So, the United States was formed in largely based upon a philosophy of libertarian individualism. And whether it be the French Revolution or the American Revolution, there was a big feeling in the 18th century and the 19th century about the arbitrary power of monarchical forces, of the king, but also their governors and colonial administrators. And so that's why you could read the Bill of Rights, for example, as a document addressing police power. Now, if you were to sort of fast forward to the conservative iteration, or the contemporary iteration of conservative thought on this issue, you've seen conservative forces take up the mantle of criminal justice reform. The Koch brothers have put a lot of money into this, and some of this Koch brother money has ended up in Democratic organizations or left-leaning organizations like Campaign Zero. That's how the nonprofit industrial complex works. All of this money is funded into think tanks. One of the big conservative think tanks is Right on Crime, and there's several others. And a lot of these organizations, are sort of proposing their own sort of police reform policies. I think I'm particularly impressed by Representative Justin Amash, is that his name? Amash?
Yeah, from Michigan, yeah.
Yeah, I'm particularly impressed by some of his statements recently on qualified immunity. He's been a big public advocate, and even among some of my conservative friends, there is a general belief that that some of these issues are real and demand immediate action, and I think that's a really great thing. And I'm really happy to see that. I also, though, I'm kind of interested to know how conservatives might think about the campaign for defunding the police, precisely because of its relationship to a type of fiscal conservatism in which the issues about austerity, tightening our belts, not spending so much money are directly tied to the budget, in which every single municipality or county here in the United States is spending most of its money on police or local prisons. And that's not money that's going to our hospitals, to our nurses fighting coronavirus who don't have the necessary equipment, to our schools, to social services, to transportation services. And I'm very interested to see what sort of, cross ideology relationships we can form on this issue.
Well,
Now,
yeah, interesting question. I think we already have, in the sense that conservatives like President Trump and others support decriminalizing things that had been put in place during the Clinton administration, the three strikes law and all the rest, and putting people in prison, and that as a byproduct is going to save huge amounts of money, probably even including the police departments, but certainly in other areas of justice and prisons. I mean, it's costing, how much money does each prisoner cost every year? It's a fortune. So, yeah, I mean that's something
in California, we pay, I think, $70,000, $80,000 a year for per inmate here in California.
There you go.
So, and the growth of mass incarceration here in the United States was a bipartisan movement by Democrats and Republicans. Now, I would push
right, but
back.
it was done during the Clinton administration, and I think that the real vocal people against it were Republicans and conservatives. There was, and I suppose people on the far left.
So yeah, I mean, I think that you could look at the rise of mass incarceration. A lot of people have, as a backlash to the civil rights movement. And some of the biggest crime bills actually were passed in 1968 by the LBJ administration. And when Richard Nixon ran for president, he ran as the quote unquote law and order candidate.
Sure.
And he launched a war on crime that was then continued by President Reagan with a war on drugs.
Actually, it was Bush Sr. that was the big war on drugs guy. But
they both had a role in that. And I think that we're seeing some of those relationships play out with the Trump administration. Donald Trump refers to himself as the law and order candidate.
Right.
And I'm sure you're familiar with the Republican advisor, Frank Luntz. Frank Luntz just came out with an article saying that maybe we're witnessing the end of the conservative law and order coalition. And I think these are important things to think about in our analysis. But maybe let's turn to the issue of race, if you don't mind.
Not at all. I just want to, before we do, I just want to briefly comment on the law and order thing, and then we'll go to race.
Yeah, let's hear it.
What the heck, right? I think that the question of law and order is really the main impetus of that are radicals, revolutionaries, criminals, and thugs who are burning black businesses primarily in predominantly black neighborhoods, burning and looting black homes and businesses, killing black people. And that it's a political thing. I mean, it's like the group Antifa and to a certain extent, their what do they call it? The how they all connect. I forget the word for that. Transsectional with other groups that are also radical. And that this is what they mean by law and order, not going after some guy with a nickel bag of marijuana. They're talking about going after people who are really trying to rip apart the social order in those communities and who are subversive politically. So, to my way of thinking, that's the main focus for conservatives. And I would hope that good liberals would join in that, because after all, the main targets of that are minorities. The main people that are being killed and looted are black people. But let's use that as a bridge to talk about race.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can try to turn to race. I mean, I would think that there's some really important undercurrents about race in the way that Trump frames his own approach of being a law and order president, of saying that, mayors and governors need to quote unquote dominate. And
right. Against anarchy.
They are sort of, there's also, at least amongst the left, and I think that, to take your point seriously, Charles, I do think that we are seeing a new rise of uprisings in the United States. And, so some people have been making allusions to the 1960s. And, we could have a conversation about, the problematic aspects of quote unquote peaceful protests, of, the sort of, sort of more militant aspects of the left wing. But there's also the rise of a militant right wing as well. And, we've seen a lot of incidents in which people have tried to plow their cars through protesters. And there have been laws made by Republicans to make that legal. And we're just seeing a lot of ways in which, whether you agree or disagree, some people on the left think that Trump utilizes codes and signals to encourage this sort of voluntarism by, sort of white, aggrieved, sort of racist or semi-racist, Republican voters. But
Well, I mean, I don't agree, and I think that the predominant there's always a right-wing fringe out there. I suppose the KKK. I mean, even though they used to be Democrat and they still are Democratic shock troops. Putting that aside, that's a fringe thing that's not really changed that much. They've always been there. They probably always will be there. But the main group of people that are doing the violence and the agitation is the sort of intersectional left groups that operate in a classic communistic style, in that they don't have like a leader that marches out and makes announcements. It's sort of like they all think alike and they know how to operate autonomously. I'll give it's kind of a personal anecdote, but I remember asking my late communist uncle back I'm a lot older than you, but this is way back in the day. I was like, how does this work? I mean, do you take your orders from the Kremlin? I mean, who sends, the marching orders? And his answer was, we don't get anything like that because we don't need it. We all think alike. We all know what to do. We are all stimulated by the same, what's going on. We just, it's part of a consciousness. And I think that that's sort of what's happening. It is, predominantly a left thing. And then I think that when President Trump talks about law and order, and by asking the cities to make sure that they don't allow anarchy to develop in their cities by dominating the government, which is, I think, needed, because again, they're looting and burning black businesses and destroy, just like in the 1960s, they predominantly looted and burned down black neighborhoods. I mean, there were some cities, and I'm older than you, I remember it, that never recovered. Detroit, Newark, neighborhoods of Chicago, completely burned, lives destroyed, businesses wiped out, and it took the black community almost a generation to recover from that. I think that we don't want to see that happening again. They are the primary targets of this, ironically, I suppose, but maybe that's where you get fodder for a revolution. I don't know. I mean, now I'm not here to condemn and say that most liberals agree with this. I don't think they do at all. Although I think there's a tendency amongst more liberal-oriented pundits and media figures to give it a pass. But that's what I think is being discussed here. And I reject this idea that President Trump is sending out some kind of racist, dog whistles. I just think that's tin hat conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every data point, or both within the government and out of the government, says that there's been a massive rise in white supremacist organizations, of literature going out into the public, of even sentiments within the voter base. The number of murders and killings by white supremacist organizations has skyrocketed these past couple of years. And we could use data to sort of talk about these points,
Okay.
but I do think that maybe you bring up some interesting points about this sort of generational issue within the Black community, because I do think that some of the older Black Democratic voters did have a sort of kind of more moderate memory of the 1960s. and supported efforts by the Clinton administration for the crime bill, for welfare reform. And you even saw this play out in the current sort of Democratic divide between the Bernie Sanders wing of the party and the Joe Biden wing of the party, who was the author of the 1994 crime control bill. And some of this is the biggest divide within the Democratic base right now is a generational divide between older and younger Democrats. Now, let's get to this idea of race, because I think that, and I can hear in your own comments, and I see it on the news, I see it on my social media pages and comments by friends and, my community, that the issue of race is really the flashpoint in which people become super frustrated and animated and maybe super contentious with each other about these issues. And Black Lives Matter movement has taken the issue of police killings and mass incarceration and framed it entirely in terms of racial politics. And in one respect, it's an important frame to think about, not just in trying to look at the history of race relations in the United States, but also because there are a disproportionate number of Blacks who are killed by police and who are inside prisons. But there is also some people who are at least critical, and there is a schism within Black intellectuals on this issue. Aldolph Reed, for example, wrote an article trying to argue about how police killings are not determinative based upon race, but actually, if you take class into consideration, you would find that because the Black population doesn't have the accumulated assets as the white community, that there is a way to say that the targeting of Black people is actually maybe a targeting of poor people. And I would remind, that the most disproportionate number of people killed by police forces are Native Americans, the indigenous community. The largest number of people killed by police are white men, over 600 last year. And there is a massive population of white people inside prisons as well. So these are really contentious issues, and it makes it it makes people's emotions come into the fold, and it kind of creates this political polarized dynamic. And I really wish we could try to find a way to get past some of this. However, I try to listen to the Black community, Black activists, and their use of data is very convincing. And the ways in which money that is being funneled to police and prisons as a political fix to social ills involving poverty, there is a strong argument to be made that we have systematically impoverished certain parts of the American population while enriching other parts of the American population, both long-term historically, but also in the near term as well. And so that's why a lot of, at least the issue of divestment and reinvestment, of defunding the police, is becoming a focal frame in which to think about what might be reform efforts that we could look forward to. And the movement to defund the police comes out of a really rich tradition associated with abolitionist thinkers and supported by activists on the ground. That's why we've seen, the call by Minneapolis City Council to quote unquote disband the Minneapolis Police Department, to replace it with community-based public safety, and then references to the Camden model, Camden, New Jersey, as a possible solution. And I think that we should actually realize that already with that recent decision, we're seeing the language of defunding the police be sort of translated into a new technologically friendly version of policing. The Camden model, for example, relied upon a massive increase in surveillance technologies.
That has its own troubling element to it, and just you touched on a lot of really interesting points here. As far as the surge in white supremacy, the Southern Poverty Law Center keeps stats on that, and they pointed out that there did begin to be an uptick, not a surge. I mean, I would hardly say that it's shooting through the roof, but it did show a little bit of an uptick, starting with the Trayvon Martin incident in 2012, and then it started to build a little bit more during Ferguson. And it's kind of it's sort of there where it is. It's kind of at a plateau. It's not a major thing. It's they're always out there in the fringes. Those types. If you lift up enough rocks, you're gonna find them.
Are you familiar with the Amy Cooper video?
No.
So Amy Cooper, right before the incident involving George Floyd, Amy Cooper was walking in New York City, Central Park.
Oh yes, of course. And then she was like, "Oh my God, there's a black man." I saw.
Yeah, and called the police on him. And Amy Cooper was a liberal.
Right.
And there's a lot of Amy Coopers within liberal democratic circles.
Yeah, but I would hardly call her a white supremacist. I mean, she just was a woman out fearful. I mean, obviously someone who's, I've seen that happen. I mean, people, all of a sudden they become gripped with fear.
Sure.
And yeah, it definitely had a race element to it for sure.
Well, I think that's why maybe we can, make pretty clear distinctions between the white supremacists that we might be seeing in places like Charlottesville,
Right.
and the people who have, implicit bias. I mean, implicit bias is a real thing. I have implicit bias. I, have really struggled with, anti-Blackness within myself, and trying to interrogate some of those white privileges that I have, which is actually not just an individual thing, it's a structure. There is an institutional arrangement in which certain voices and certain faces are always centered, and they're centered in our media, they're centered in our politics. And I think that the Amy Cooper complex is a complex that's a bipartisan issue. And I think that we have a lot to do to deconstruct the issue of whiteness within our society. You talked about the Irish. Like I said, I'm a historian by trade. And, one of the ways in which people have talked about whiteness is, and particularly issues like, the Irish or Catholics who actually weren't considered white, in the 19th century,
right. Mm-hmm.
is a lot of times that they actually sort of earned their whiteness by, becoming police officers. And, you see this relationship with certain institutions like police that sort of embed, sort of subterranean racial relations in a way that might not be immediately obvious. And I think that it's really important that we try to uncover the veil of institutional racism that might not look like what we remember racism to be in the 1960s. So I'm very influenced by a book called Racism Without Racists. And, I think that a lot of your conservative listeners, might find a lot to learn in that, because, trying to think about issues of racism without always thinking in this sort of really polarizing way about being a racist is an important way that we can do a lot of self-reckoning individually and collectively about race relations in this country. And I guess I study these issues about whiteness as well.
Right.
And it's a big part of how I, am writing some of my dissertation. I probably will write some things that members of my academic community will probably disagree with pretty vehemently. But nevertheless, I think that, there is a history to all this.
Oh yeah.
And
I mean, it sounds to
as
me like the book you're talking about is very interesting. Maybe I should interview the author. Maybe you and I should come on together and interview the author. We could do we could launch on this program a national discussion on race and bring in people. No, it's just something I'm trying to think about right now. As far as what you're saying, like implicit racism, I mean, I totally get that. My grandparents' generation, they went out of their way to try to be white and to try to pass as white and did so. And my brothers to this day, if I ask them about their ethnic background, they're white. I mean, they wouldn't, the idea of not thinking of themselves as such would be completely alien to them. So, and yet I also appreciate the fact that a Black person it's a lot harder to do that because of their physical traits. You can see that they're Black. It's like they can't just pass as white. I mean, so, there is this burden, and I can't put myself in their shoes. I understand that. What I can do is look at policies that I think have hurt race relations and have fanned the flames of race conflict in this country. It's a big subject. We probably don't have time to get into it right now. I am very condemning of what I view as leftist policies starting in the 1960s that hurt the Black family, hurt the Black church, hurt Black education, hurt Black business. And I think that had those policies been done a little differently, maybe even a little bit more conservatively, you'd see Black people today much more, and they are anyways, thank goodness, but they would be much more part of the middle class. They would be much more integrated, much more, you wouldn't have this kind of crime problem and drug problem and murder problem that we now have, which I think is a legacy of those programs. But anyway, we're kind of reaching toward the end, Andy, and I want you to have the last word. So um, talk a little bit about your thinking now and about your work, and, give my listeners and audience any websites you'd want to share. Are you the author of a book or anything like that?
I mean, I'm just trying to finish my dissertation. I'm trying to hopefully get a job one day. I mean, we're sort of looking at the oncoming austerity and maybe an oncoming depression because of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty scary time out there, particularly within higher education. There's a sort of systematic issue within higher education and, being able to get, jobs as teachers. We need more teachers out in the world.
Right.
And so, I'm just going to be trying to finish my dissertation. I guess we originally came here to address my fascism essay, but we never.
We'll have to do another show on that because that's such a rich subject. That's I mean, I've written a few books on that topic, and that's something. Yes, you're right. That was what we. Then you toss. We have a topical issue, so that's always first when you do broadcasting. But I should have you back for that. I'd like to really delve into that. We don't have time right now today.
Sure. Well, but, I guess maybe as a form of conclusion, I always really love, people to read my work and to reach out to me. I really think it's important to try to write in a way that's not just for academics, but that tries to communicate with the public. And that includes people, who identify themselves as conservatives. I think that, people have they have really complex political theologies, everyone, people
Sure.
in suburbs, people in conservative circles, people in liberal circles, people in radical circles. And, I really believe that, people have really complex politics, and a lot of these issues about policing really get to some of the myths that we believe about politics. And I think it's really important to try to communicate to everyday folks and kind of try to listen to them and connect with their common sense understanding. And I hope that whether it be your conservative listeners, would take seriously the call to defund the police. I think that we have an out of control police state in this country. We have a massive prison industrial complex. We have a budget in which almost all of the money that our tax dollars fund is to tanks and weapons and tear gas and SWAT departments. And I think that there is a lot of communication that we can do to find common ground on these issues.
Oh, I agree.
I know that there is a lot of political intensity about these issues, and people sort of get into their boxes. And I think that it is really important to break down those boxes and communicate with people, because I feel once you actually start listening to people, you actually find out that pretty much everyone's really smart, and that you might have fundamental disagreements. But if you're willing to listen, you can actually find a lot of agreement. And the defund the police is sort of a public policy friendly version of what radicals and abolitionists have been calling for. But the reason why it's a public policy friendly approach is because it gets to the central issue, in that we put our money predominantly into these institutions of authority and violence, and we're not putting them back into our communities. And these are your dollars. They're my dollars. They're your listeners' dollars. And I think that we need to make sure that our institutions locally, as well as nationally, are more accountable to us. And but fights over budgets are never sexy. No one really likes to talk about the budget, but the budget is where politics is made. And trying to dive into the political power of police departments and the power that they hold over mayors, over city councils, over counties, over state legislatures is massive, and it's understudied here within political science, and it's under talked about. I know that you have strong thoughts about the uprisings that are happening, but I think that if you oppress a community long enough, you have to expect that they are going to respond in anger and frustration. And we have to do a better job of listening to those communities, of knowing that, they've had generation after generation of Black men who end up in prison, who can't take care of their families, and who are being killed by police, and that are also involved in these sort of economic conditions of poverty, of forms of urban segregation that still exist with redlining, of bad access to education, bad healthcare facilities. And we can confront these issues, and we can do a lot better job of trying to solve them. And I really appreciate you having me on. I really appreciate anyone that might have been listening that might not share my politics, but maybe was willing to, be empathetic to some of the ideas that I was trying to express. And I hope that, maybe we can establish a relationship that goes on after this.
Very good. All right, Andrew Johnson. Listen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
All right. Talk to you soon. Thank you.